Welcome to the Denver Broncos Daily Fantasy Team Preview. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay, breaking down the previous year's Super Bowl champs. A lot has changed, especially under center this year. Kind of an interesting offense. More interesting because I don't think it's going to be a pretty one personally. I think there's just going to be a whole lot of ugliness to this offense, but maybe I could be wrong. I mean, maybe Sanchez can come under center and do pretty well, but I think it's asking a lot.
It's gonna be not what we've come to expect from the Demaryius Thomases and Emmanuel Sanders of the world, but at the same time, I do think there is some salvageable fantasy value from those two. A lot of like talk of Emmanuel Sanders' demise. I'm not totally buying that. We saw him succeed with Brock Osweiler last year, so I'd pump the brakes on that for sure before we even get into this. I guess we can start talking about the passing game, but yeah, I mean, last year's distribution, Demaryius and Emmanuel, over 300 targets last year, over 50% of the pass attempts thrown went in their direction. Obviously, they combined for 2,400 receiving yards, which is top three in the league in terms of combos. So I see them taking a step back and maybe Sanders a little more than Demaryius, but at the same time, it's not like they just got space jammed and lost all their skills.
No, and I think for me, it's more so of the guys they are priced around. I think that's going to be my biggest issue with using those guys is when you look at a Thomas, he's not quite in the Jones, Beckham Jr., Hopkins price range, but he's around Keenan Allen, Alshon Jeffrey, Robinson, guys who are in much stabler passing games. I guess that's going to be my problem with using them. I'm fine in GPP still using those two just because, as you mentioned, the target share is still strictly heavy for both of them. And it's not like Sanchez is out there and it's his first year and he's never played an NFL game before. I still think it's just going to be a heavy run offense and let this defense that's intact do its job.
Right, and yeah, Sanchez had Braylon Edwards at the tail end of his career. He had Santonio Holmes post-prime, post-Steelers career. But he's never really had these types of receivers before. And while they're going to be run heavy, which we'll get into C.J. Anderson in a second, I still see Demaryius sort of being that low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 before it's all said and done, sort of as the year progresses. Going to have some low-floor games, that's for sure, just based on they're not going to need to run or they're not going to need to pass that much every game. But overall, I mean, I'm still relatively high on them. I think there's going to be some nice tournament options for them early in the season.
Yeah, I definitely think tournament options early on is going to be the way to go, and I think way to get lower ownership. And it's something that I'm going to be picky with as far as when matchups come around, especially with this team, just because I think it is going to be a game flow heavy, way to break down Denver. And as far as the other options outside of those two, I mean, I don't really see any threats to really put into my lineups. I mean, tight end situation is pretty weak. Virgil Green, and behind Sanders and Thomas, you got Benny Fowler, Jordan Norwood. I mean, Cody Latimer, if he ever makes some noise. I mean, you really don't have anyone behind those guys to really do anything. It's going to be a pretty strict offense as far as where to target.
And yeah, those three receivers you just mentioned kind of give me a frowny face. Cody Latimer, a former second-round pick, he has all you look for in a receiver. It just hasn't been able to put it together. You wonder if they start to try to force him onto the field to say, make or break season, let's see what you can do. But we'll see. Sounds optimistic from camp that he's had some good practices, but overall, I mean, I don't think you can expect anyone else to sort of emerge as a third option in this offense, even more so now with sort of that Manning type offense gone. I think it's going to be just two guys really. And then obviously Owen Daniels gone. He took up 77 targets last year. Vernon Davis gone. You mentioned Virgil Green still there. They got Jeff Heuerman, who was a former third-round pick by them 2 years ago. And I mean, that's pretty ugly too. So I don't see anyone emerging from there. I'm not too optimistic about Benny Fowler, Jordan Norwood, or Cody Latimer. So I see it still being pretty strictly those top two guys.
Yeah, and that's one of the good things. I mean, we talked about the Chiefs, where they may not throw a ton. You expect them to kind of play similar, run the ball, play good defense, and but that's okay when you have two guys who get all the targets. It's fine.
Right. Right.
And so I'm okay with using them in a tournament sense. It's just going to be about a pricing thing for me, I think. And looking at the week one numbers, I don't see myself really gravitating towards using them even in tournaments. It's just more there's too many other options around them. If they do start to drop based on performance come mid-year, maybe I'll start taking some more shots with them.
That's fair.
So as far as the running backs, I mean, C.J. Anderson, Ronnie Hillman, last year was sort of a up and down year for both of them, and they both had their stretches where they performed, and towards the end of the year it got a little frustrating because it seemed like, oh, Anderson's in a great spot, oh wait, no, Hillman went off this week, and vice versa. But Anderson, I mean, coming into this season, here we go again. He's projected to be the starting back, has shown stretches where he can be a number one running back, and I'm going to be okay with using him in a tournament, since I don't think anyone in this offense is quite cash game worthy for me.
So I have a few basic rules for myself that he sort of had a few red flags for me last year. Most notably, he was an undrafted free agent. I don't necessarily not like undrafted free agents. I just think we have to be very wary of the lack of commitment teams have to them. They can lose that role at any moment or any injury, and then their role's just gone. There's no guaranteed money in their favor, and they're just tossed out the window. So this offseason heading in, it sort of seemed like they were going to let him go. He goes to Miami, signs that deal, and they bring him back, get him that deal, and here we go. So, I mean, I'm pretty confident in him now that they re-signed him, showed a commitment. He has some guaranteed money on the books now. And he's number one on the depth chart. So I'm in this year much more than last year. I feel much more comfortable about his price. And I think he could have some really high upside games in some game flow positive Denver Broncos games where they're just dominating the other team offensively, or defensively, I should say, and they just get to run out the clock with C.J. Anderson.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going to be looking to use him, is in those situations where, just as you mentioned, I mean, defense is going to be stout, and another top three defenses here, where they hold teams in check, and also because the passing game is still a big question mark, you're probably going to see them lean definitely heavier on the run. Is there any way that Hillman still can sneak in without an Anderson injury?
So the guy I've kind of been watching closely since the draft is Devontae Booker, who's sort of similar to C.J. Anderson. Initial depth chart said he was ahead of Hillman. I don't see that by the time we get to week one. But I will say there is a lot of injury upside with this team. Whoever gets that role, if Anderson does go down, if it's Hillman, obviously we're throwing him in and cash that next week, basing that on that it's going to be a reduced price. But I also think Devontae Booker is sort of a guy to definitely keep an eye on as training camp goes along. And, I mean, if he can start to steal touches as the year goes on, some blowout games might be some interesting tournament moves for him.
Yeah, definitely. And if they do have a heavy run game, I mean, Anderson's not going to carry the entire workload. I mean, so it could still be one of those things where, because the workload is so high for the running backs, that maybe it becomes, Hillman becomes a little bit of a better option, even if Anderson's still there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Kind of like what we saw with Charles Sims and Doug Martin last year, where even though Sims wasn't getting a ton of touches, it's kind of like, well, this could be a GPP this week, and quite a few times it hit. So yeah, I could see two of those backs sort of solidifying and making it a bit of a committee.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as picking on this defense, it was sort of a golden rule not to. And I think that's obviously going to carry much of the same weight this year.
I mean, if any, I'm assuming everyone who's listening to this watched the Super Bowl. Von Miller is just an animal. And I mean that in the most complimentary and respective way ever. But it's just, he's a beast. There's no there's no one offensive lineman that can really block him. So that's going to be an issue for a lot of teams where they're just one man down because they need to put two guys on him.
Yeah, and the secondary was something that just held wide receivers in check, and I expect that to be very similar again.
Absolutely.
So that's going to wrap it up with our Denver team breakdown. Be sure to check out the rest of our teams at dailyfantasycafe.com.